Hello there, and welcome to episode 107 of TheKillFile. I am so glad that you guys are back for another story. This week I have a special preview for my listeners with another installment of The Hidden Files, the bonus content from TheKillFile. The Hidden Files are on a break right now, but they will be back. For now, if you want to check out more episodes, you can find them over on Patreon. I took this week off for my 40th birthday and to work on the sound quality of the podcast. I have a new microphone set up and I'll be trying it out and adjusting, so bear with me as I'm working hard for all of you. Enjoy this bonus episode about a team of rugby players who get lost in the Andes and had to resort to unthinkable things to survive. See you guys next week for another regular episode of The Kill File. Welcome to The Hidden Files, an extension of your favorite podcast, The Kill File. Here we will cover different stories and cases than we normally would. This is the place where we will get to learn about various people and places in a setting that will be a little lighter than the dark corners of true crime. Get ready for a wild journey into some great tales with twists, laughs, and commentary from yours truly. Hello, and welcome to another installment of The Hidden Files, an extension of your favorite true crime podcast, The Kill File. I'm so glad that you guys are here for another story. Before we jump in, just a few quick reminders. First, if you know someone who may enjoy these types of cases or stories that we do here on The Hidden Files, I hope that you will help to spread the word that we are on Patreon and Spotify for just $3, because it will help so much in the production of both podcasts. And if you do spread the word, thank you guys so much for your support, and I will keep trying my best as always. Next, don't forget to find your merch on the website, TheKillFile.com, and also fill out that listener files form with your own stories because it would make such an interesting episode here and there for The Hidden Files. Lastly, don't forget to follow us on social media. We are on Blue Sky, TikTok, Instagram, and of course, Facebook, where I now have an alternate page where you can follow me and learn about my personal life a little bit. Okay, that's it for business. Let's talk about today's story. Today, we are going to be talking about the will to live as we discuss the Uruguayan Flight 571. Here we go. Today's story is going to take us to Montevideo, Uruguay, in the year of 1972. According to an AI overview of Montevideo in the early 70s, it was a time marked for the political unrest and rising tensions in the country. Not only were the leftist guerrilla groups coming about, but people were being assassinated and kidnapped as well. Path of student activism, on the other hand, would create something called the Broad Front, which was actually formed in 1971, known for its rebellious stance on things like political control, exploitation of labor forces, and economic domination. The other side to the time period in this area of Montevideo was a plethora of the sweeter things in life, like food. The country was on the brink of social and political upheaval, and when things around you are changing and surging, one could find themselves enjoying the things in life that matter, like family, culture, and even sports. Today's story is going to put the spotlight on a rugby team who may not have realized just how good they had it before Friday the 13th in October, when their lives would be changed forever. The Old Christians Club rugby union team, along with many others, were going to be boarding a TAMU flight, which is short for Military Air Transport Plane. For the research into today's story, I stumbled upon the documentary for what happened, and let me tell you how amazing this documentary was. I watched it, and I'm going to heavily use it for this story, but of course mine will be the shortened version, and they had the author of the book that I believe that the actual documentary is based on, so I'm just going to give credit now to them so that you guys can find the documentary or book and enjoy them for yourselves. I am telling you that they will not disappoint. Okay, so the documentary film that I watched is called I Am Alive, Surviving the Andes Plane Crash, which came out in 2010, directed by Brad Osborne, and the author of just one of the books that came out about the incident, and I believe what they based the film on is called Alive, The Story of the Andes Survivors by a Mr. Piers, PaulRead. He was interviewed on the documentary, and he just seemingly was a wonderful human being and very insightful. So, again, if you get the chance, check out everything you can. I believe there's also a Hollywood movie about this story and other books written by the survivors. Okay, so the team was on board the plane and took off on October 12th, headed to Chile to play rugby as many of the remaining players had done the year before. With the team was the team's physician and his wife, 19 of the rugby players, as well as other supporters and families who would join them on the plane leaving from Uruguay to Santiago in Chile. As it turns out, if they filled the empty seats of the plane, it would be cheaper for them all. One of the main rugby players that we are going to be talking about basically is kind of like the main hero in this story. Not that everyone who survived weren't heroes by any means. I'm just saying the focus is usually on a handful of these players, and one that stood out among the rest was a Nando Parrado. Nando was very excited to be able to call up his mother when 2 seats were available and tell her and one of his sisters, Susie, who was 17 years old at the time, to pack their bags. He was taking them to Santiago. The team boarded the Fairchild F-227, a plane of the Uruguayan Air Force. Apparently, it was the cheapest way to get everyone to the destination, chartering a military craft. Now, a few things of note about this aircraft. There were said to be only like 78 of these things built, and of the 78, I guess 23 of them ended up crashing. And there were 393 fatalities. Obviously, no one getting on the plane knew that. So, because of this airplane itself and its capabilities, or lack thereof, the pilot of the plane, a captain in the Uruguayan Air Force, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, had to divert from a straight-across path to a more U-turn type path. The Andes being so high in altitude and the plane not being able to go that high or would have been too stressful on the plane made the plane head south first. When they got to an area called Mendoza, the plane would have to make an unexpected stop for the night due to inclement weather. Captain Ferradas was said to have had 5,200 flying hours with 29 crossovers of the Andes, and while that was a fair amount, by today's standards, the hours of flying was not enough. The training for the crew was adequate, the plane itself had no physical issues and no damage, and was said to be carrying 2 I always have a hard time saying this word, Rolls-Royce engines with just 1,700 horsepower, which to me sounded like a lot, but apparently that is not strong enough for certain things. The Fairchild was said to have a climbing max altitude of 22,500 feet, and because some of the peaks in the Andes can be as high as 22,838 feet, an alternate route was taken for this type of airplane commonly. The next morning, they took off again south towards something called the Planchon Pass, which was a great thing because the altitude was lower and easier on the plane. However, the Andes are not forgiving. In fact, the mountains themselves rise extremely fast in altitude and stature, and because of the ever-present storms, the wind speeds up quickly and strong clouds are known to form, giving to lower visibility. As the plane had taken off, the boys were seemingly in good spirits, with survivors commenting on how they laughed and played cards, and Nando's mother handed out some treats to the people sitting near her. A survivor of the crash and rugby player named Gustavo Zebrino would say that the boys were singing and laughing and throwing a ball. As Nando sat next to his best friend Panchito Abal, Panchito had asked Nando to switch him seats since Nando was next to the window. Panchito wanted to be able to see out of the window a little better for a while, and of course Nando didn't mind. Later, he would say it was one of those tiny decisions that you don't even think about that changed the course of his life forever. As the plane was making its way along the route and at 3:21 p.m., the co-pilot, La Guarara, radioed to the air traffic control saying that the plane had passed over the Paso del Planchon, or Planchon for short, which is a high-altitude mountain pass that is on the border of Argentina and Chile mountains. However, this was inaccurate. On the documentary, there would be people speaking to the fact that this crash was a human error and had nothing to do with the aircraft, plain and simple. People make mistakes, but not everyone in their lifetime will have the unfortunate consequences of making a fatal mistake. Simply put, the area that the co-pilot believed they had passed should have taken them 11 minutes, when in fact, they were only 3 minutes into the area, and there was actually nothing to mark the location of the Planchon, at least not today, as the cloud coverage below them had quickly covered the ground, although at this point they could still see with the clouds seemingly closing in. The aircraft got permission to turn north from air traffic control because they falsely believed that they were past the Planchon. The aircraft then turned north into the Andes Mountains, completely off course. No one would realize anything was off or wrong until the mood shifted, all starting with a little turbulence. One of the other main rugby players that we are going to hear a lot about is a man named Roberto Canessa, who I will just call Roberto because that is how Nando referred to him. He would comment as the pilot started to ascend that there were clouds and mountains around them. Carlitos Paez, another survivor, remembers that one of the cabin crew members had walked by them and gave a little warning to the boys to put their seatbelts on because the plane was going to dance a little. He seemed to recall this sentence vividly, but at the moment, it was light turbulence, and no one seemed worried much at all. Not long after this, the turbulence became heavier, and the mood was starting to change for the passengers. A twinge of concern was on people's faces as they quickly realized this turbulence was more than anyone had anticipated. As the passengers were still believing the aircraft was headed towards Chile, the plane started shaking more violently, and through the clouds, the boys could see rocks and mountains surrounding them. According to the book written about this crash by Mr. Piers' PaulRead, the plane started hitting air pockets and dropping a few hundred feet at a time. As some people started being nervous, others were not seemingly understanding what was happening. Nando hadn't even buckled his seatbelt. His mother Eugenia and his sister Susan were holding hands now. As the engine accelerated, panic and fear started to strike passengers, and some began to pray. Nando would later say that he had about 5 or 6 seconds to realize what was happening before the aircraft crashed. The pilot realized at some point that they were about to fly straight into a mountain, and he pulled up, trying to accelerate and ascend the plane into a small half-circle dip in the mountain edge, where maybe the plane could fly through untouched, but they were not so lucky. I guess had the plane been slightly left or right, the plane would have smashed into oblivion, but luckily for the survivors, this is not what happened. Instead, the right side of the wing made impact and tore off, and the fuselage and tail broke apart, and the nose of the plane started to dive, and in some places, the roof was torn off. For anyone who isn't exactly sure what the fuselage is on an airplane, it's just like the main body or like the part where the passengers are compared to like the cockpit or the tail or whatever. So the front part of the aircraft would end up breaking off from the tail, and at some point, both wings were gone, and now the fuselage was just barreling downwards. But thankfully, it would hit a steep valley, and the fuselage and front would slide down the mountain and stopped around 3:32 p.m. during the crash. The snow had actually helped the plane come to a stop, and the passengers who survived were very lucky. Initially, 12 of the 45 people said to be on the Fairchild, including passengers and the crew, would die upon impact, including the pilot and 2 of the crew members. The rest were passengers. As the plane was coming to its crashing stop, the survivors would recount the sounds of screams and panic while the people were shouting, "Help me." When the plane was finally still, there would be heard sounds of some life with groans from the over 33 people injured, crying and prayers. Nando had been thrown from the back of the plane to the front and would be in a coma, with the remaining survivors assuming he was dead initially, saying that his face was so swollen that they could barely recognize him, and they ended up having to move his body towards an open part of the fuselage to get to the others who were wounded. Nando's sister also initially survived the crash, but sadly their mother had perished, with her body being what was recalled as wrapped around a seat. The plane was at 11,000 feet altitude, as all of these people from Uruguay had barely any knowledge of snow or ice. One person would recall that the max altitude of Uruguay as being only around 500 meters, and what they were now sitting in was completely unknown to them. Pretty quickly, the people who weren't as bad off started getting to the people who were injured and doing what they could to get them out, or out of their positions at least. Unfortunately, when it came to the co-pilot, he was pinned down in a way that there was no way that he would survive. In fact, he asked the boys to bring him the revolver so that he could put himself out of his misery. This is when Roberto realized that he was the only person who could tell them where they were, but the co-pilot would be mistaken, as he had told them that they were past Corico, and he was said to be in shock as well. Had the co-pilot been correct, and they had passed Corico, then the fuselage would have been towards the western slope of the Andes, but instead, they had crashed in Argentina, with the area they were now stuck in being completely remote, with absolutely nothing around them but peaks of mountains ranging from 14,000 feet to 18,000 feet and steep, rocky walls. One of the things that was talked about often on the documentary and within the research was how strong the will to survive is when facing such a tragedy or horrific event such as a plane crash in the middle of the Andes. It was very surprising to see how the people came together to survive and the strength and fortitude they had to help each other stay alive. While they were still gathering themselves and figuring out what to do, they realized that they needed to try to protect themselves from the freezing temperatures and from the elements of the mountains. This is why they would start to move the dead bodies towards the opening of the plane so that they could have more space to stay together and help each other out. One survivor would speak to just how horrific that first night was for them all because the sun had set that first evening at just 4 p.m., where the temperatures would usually drop to 30 below zero. And that night, they had to wait for around 15 hours just for the sun to come back up and give them slight warmth. The first night that the survivors of the crash were stranded, 5 more people would die. The next morning, the remaining 28 people still alive had actually heard a plane above them, but the problem was the fuselage was colored white, and they were completely surrounded by snow. It was nearly impossible to see from above. When they showed the video of being able to finally see the plane from like only 300 yards away in the sky, it was still almost completely blended in with the snow. I could not believe how hard it was to see because I thought that since it was so huge, like someone would surely see it eventually, but holy shit, it was nuts. The lesson here is don't fly white planes over giant mountain ranges. Paint those fuckers bright pink so they can be seen. The group started to look for the essential things that they would need to survive, obviously food and water, and unfortunately the only thing that they could find as far as food went was a little bit of chocolate and some liquor. This was stated to be only enough caloric intake to actually maintain like 10 adults for just 24 hours. That's how little it was. And remember, there are still 28 of them at this point. They would ration what they had been able to find, and each person would get a tiny piece of food for the next few days. On the third day after the crash, the group would finally realize that Nando was not dead. Yeah, he was in a coma the entire time and was put in with the dead people towards the holes of the fuselage, and this act itself maybe saved his life. They had a doctor on the documentary who would state that the natural elements of the Andes did the exact same treatment that the hospital would have basically done for Nando had he gotten to one. Turns out that science has figured out that the only way to preserve the brain for something like that is extremely low temperatures, like hypothermia, and because he was right next to an opening, it helped keep him alive. When Nando started to come to, he would recount how he remembered seeing faces of his friends, and he had immediately asked about his mother and sister. They had to, unfortunately, tell him that his mother had passed, but that his sister was still alive, but badly injured. Nando would say that he literally crawled to his sister and held her in his arms, wanting to see if he could save her, but there wasn't really anything he could do. He said that he felt like his sister knew that he was there, but she couldn't speak, and that night she died in his arms. Heartbreaking. Outside, all anyone could see were mountains, rocks, snow, and ice, meaning they were deep in the mountain range. Back in civilization, after news that the plane had assumed to have been crashed, a search and rescue plan was executed between 3 countries, but they failed to find anything. The boys had actually had a transistor radio that they could only listen to when it came to the news of the rescue efforts. The team's rugby coach believed that the entire team had died, especially with the efforts being unsuccessful. Carlito Paez's father, a man named Carlos, said he never gave up the search for his son, not for the entire stretch of time they were missing. By day 10, there were still 27 people alive, now that they had lost Susie, but survivors would say that hope was quickly fading. I guess at first they felt like someone was going to come and someone was going to save them, that they just had to hang on. Until that 10th day, when they would say that they overheard something on the radio. The group was seemingly completely shattered and disheartened when they would hear that the search efforts for the plane crash were going to end. Can you fucking imagine hearing that over the radio while you were stranded, starving, freezing, dying up there in the mountains? Holy shit. Around this time is when the same thought started to strike many of the people still alive. First, let's talk a second about what starvation does to your body. They had a little overview on the documentary, but I wanted to know more. So, we all know that you can't survive more than a few days without water, but what about food? And what happens? According to theconversation.com, the first stage starts within 48 hours of the last food intake, when the body will start to take glycogen that is stored in your liver to keep up your blood sugar levels. When the glycogen runs out, this is when the second stage of starvation would begin. Your body then begins to make glucose, or sugar, for your body from other sources like muscle and fat. And while this gives things to vital organs to help you stay alive, it also takes away from your muscle rapidly and aids to the loss of nitrogen from your skeletal muscle. By just the third day, your body starts to shift into ketogenesis, taking fat and making an alternative fuel in layman's terms. Hormones begin to shift, making whatever fat you have the main source of any energy that you will actually have. But when the fat's gone, then your body has to break down its proteins for energy, which weakens the immune system and increases risks of infections to near deadly. On the documentary, it is explained that eventually your body eats its own organs as you die, basically. Gnarly stuff. So keep that in mind as we progress through the story and how that is just the scientific part of starvation, let alone the side effects of it or what's happening in your mind. When it came to the realization that they were completely out of the tiny bit of chocolate that they got every day, Carlitos would say that Nando said to him, quote, "Carlitos, I want to eat the pilot," end quote. Oh yes, here we go. Have you guys ever seen Yellow Jackets? If you haven't, you should. It's a very similar story in the ways of crashing, being deserted, and having to resort to things that one would normally never do just to survive. The group had already basically tried to eat things that they thought could keep them alive, like leather belts or part of suitcases, but they couldn't actually eat them, so they had to give up on the idea. They had been smart enough to collect water from the snow by using some of the backs of the seats and bending them in a way to let the melted snow gather into bottles like a funnel of sorts, which is very smart. But there would come a time when more than just Nando had started to contemplate whether they could eat human flesh and meat to stay alive. I'm going to say right off the bat, for me personally, I, first of all, don't judge them at all. They did exactly what they had to do to stay alive. And I believe that I would do the exact same fucking thing if I had to with zero judgment. Of course, the thought of eating someone is awful to us all. Well, most of us, I guess. But no one will ever understand what that must be like to starve like that under those circumstances and know that there is a food source, regardless of what it actually is. Nando would speak to how people would call them cannibals in the media and newspapers, but he said that he does not consider them cannibals because cannibalism, according to him, is when you kill with the goal of eating human meat. But instead, what he calls what they had to resort to having to do, it's called anthropophagy. This is the technical term for consuming human flesh or internal organs. And it actually stems from the Greek word of anthropos, which is man, and phaein, which is to eat. Now, when Nando said this to Carlitos, he thought Nando was going crazy. But when he told another survivor what Nando was thinking, they replied with something to the tune of, "Yeah, me and so-and-so had already been thinking that." They were starving, and many of them would think of how the bodies would be helping them to stay alive, and they were just doing what they needed to do to survive. The more reluctant people who weren't sure if they could partake in consuming the bodies were persuaded simply by the discussion of how the Eucharist came from the body and blood of Jesus Christ, according to the Bible. And let me remind you that these boys were part of a religious club. Some of the boys had rosaries, and they had prayed, but that confused me a little because although now I'm an atheist, I was raised Catholic, and I thought communion that we did in church and the rosaries were part of Catholicism, but the group had the word Christian in the title for the rugby team, so I didn't really understand that. Either way, the boys were faithful, and this realization that people had eaten the body and blood of Christ, even though it was bread and wine, I think, helped others to realize that it was just part of their friends and the dead's sacrifices for them to survive. As far as actually cutting up and consuming the bodies, the only tools the group had was one axe and a screwdriver, so they got creative and they made their own tools out of whatever they could salvage from the plane, and they made knives from the plastic of the windows, and they sharpened it with an axe. Later, one of these would be found at the crash site, and they showed it on the documentary. It was really neat to see. After the decision to eat the human flesh in order to save themselves, the survivors were faced with having to cut pieces of bodies away from their friends over and over again. The campfire situation was not great, as they only had a limited supply of papers or anything wood, so they weren't really able to cook the pieces of flesh often. Most of the consumption of frozen bodies was unfortunately raw. Someone on the documentary spoke to the fact that when you were in this kind of situation and your body is essentially starting to eat itself, that you may not be disgusted as you would think on a normal day having to eat human flesh. And in fact, when they consumed the organs of the bodies, their minds would have most likely told them that it tasted good because their bodies were receiving the nutrients and vitamins they so desperately needed. So the main group of people I have mentioned on the documentary I watched, which again was phenomenal, and I hope that you will go watch it, but Nando spoke often to different parts of their survival, and I have to just say how impressed I was with his resolve, his resilience, and how well he seemed to have been adjusted to what happened to them. Now, this, of course, was decades later, so they had a long time to process, but for the most part, the men who were interviewed seemed to accept that this was something that happened to them and seemed to be doing very well. Nando would in fact speak to how they were just doing what they needed in order to survive, and eventually, all of the remaining survivors made a pact that if for whatever reason they would die, to please eat their bodies and use them to stay alive. One survivor, named Zibrino, would say that because of his religion and faith, eating the flesh was not a sin, and that he knew that they had to eat the bodies before the worms did, and it didn't affect him then while they were doing it, nor did it affect him now. Which I just love, because people can judge all they want to about who does what in this world, especially when it comes to, like, the fucking difference between living and dying, but no one, and I do mean no one, knows what they could actually do unless it's happening to them. We hear this all the time when it comes to true crime, that until it's you in that situation, you have absolutely no idea how you will react to anything. Trauma, horrific news, the healing process, your flight, fight, or freeze response, nothing. We're all just humans, and we act on our instincts and do what's necessary to live. And I loved watching the matter-of-factness that these men had when it came to consuming humans to stay alive. It was very fascinating. Okay, so after the group figured out ways to survive for a bit, there was this sort of routine that they were doing, trying to stick together and live. But what none of them realized was what was coming next would be something none of them had ever been through before. The Andes are prone to avalanches. Oh, yes, they are. And it's estimated that there are 250,000 of them in the Andes alone each year. For anyone who doesn't know the strength of an avalanche, it's astonishing to learn that they can move buildings, destroy steel and metal, and basically obliterate trains or anything else in their path. One night, as the group of 27, all men and one woman, were huddled in the fuselage, they would hear what one described as the noise of horses running at them. And in almost a flash of one instant, an avalanche hit the airplane. Many of the men spoke to just how fast it went and how they had absolutely no time to react. Before they knew it, the entire inside of the fuselage was buried in snow, with everyone inside of it. Now, it's mentioned that someone who is suffocating can basically stay alive for roughly 3 minutes before they die, and when you're buried in snow, there's no oxygen, so people started having to move quickly. For a few moments after the avalanche hit, it was stated that it was completely silent until people started rescue efforts. Those who could move did, and tried furiously to uncover anyone around them, which was rough because if they're uncovering one person, they could be essentially burying another because they were so tightly packed in the fuselage. Another thing that I found interesting was the fact that whatever position the avalanche puts you in as it hits, you're stuck there. So for some, the awful pain and contortion that their bodies are put into could become a welcoming place for death as the long minutes tick by. One survivor would report that he was now buried in snow, and he realized, now I'm going to die, and said a smile came over his face that this would now all be over for him, the struggle of everything that they were going through. However, he was then saved. One man said he immediately went to go and try to save the only remaining woman with them, and as he was digging for her, he found Nando and saved his life instead. After the avalanche, there were 19 men, or boys, remaining. They quickly started to panic, realizing that they were buried in snow in the fuselage, and they wouldn't have air for much longer. They tried to calm each other and tell each other to breathe slowly and to not freak out, but one of them was like, "Why does it matter? We're going to die either way." This is when they realized that, although unfortunate, they were surrounded by more dead bodies, that now, at least they would be able to survive another month and a half with 8 more bodies if they could figure out how to survive this avalanche. For 3 days, the 19 boys survived, buried in the snow, and they would recant it actually saved them a bit from the storms passing above them, and they didn't have to endure it because they were buried. Eventually, one of them realized they gotta do something or they would truly die, and he took a pole from the luggage rack and he poked through the snow to get a small air hole, and eventually they would dig their way out. It would only take a few weeks for the fuselage to reemerge from the avalanche. Yes, weeks. The boys would again start their routine, but by this time they would slowly start to venture off little by little just to see how far they could get and what they could see. It wasn't much. The first small group to venture away from the fuselage only made it about 250 yards before they had to come right back. They seemed to struggle with when to leave or stay, and everyone seemed to have different feelings about it because, on the one hand, the plane was safe. It was their home for now, and they could live, but on the other hand, they would eventually run out of food. And if no one was searching for them anymore, they knew that they were just biding their time before death. The boys were smart and started making things like snowshoes out of seats and strapping them to their feet to be able to walk a little further. One man would say that not only was he blinded by the snow as they made it back on one occasion, but the cold had actually loosened his teeth, and he would say that his feet were basically getting gangrene. For anyone who doesn't know what that is or has heard the term but forgot, it's the death of body tissue caused by an extreme lack of blood flow. It turns the skin purple or red or even black, and if medical attention isn't given quickly, it can kill you with different infections. Nando would eventually be selected as being the leader of the expeditions to find the tail of the plane. That's essentially what they were looking for. Nando was someone that a lot of the boys had looked up to. On November 1st, so this is 1 month into the plane crash, Nando and 2 others would venture out to see how far they could make it, and he would say this was just for research. As they made their way, they started going down a little valley, and over a smaller hill was the tail that had torn off the plane. The boys got to it and searched it immediately for food and supplies. They were only able to find a small box of chocolates, a camera, some batteries, which were 24-volt, and then the expeditioners spent the night and the next morning ventured back to the fuselage with what they had gotten. They brought the batteries back in hopes that a man named Roy, who had once installed his own stereo system, could rig the batteries to the radio in the cockpit and make a call out to someone for help. Unfortunately, that's much easier said than done, and the idea would be a bust, leaving the boys once again feeling hopeless. The boys had decided to use the camera to take pictures of themselves, thinking that if they were going to die, maybe someone like 100 years from now could find the camera and see that there were people here who survived the crash for some time. 34 days into the crash now, the people who were injured or were weaker than the others were starting to die off. Zebrino would say during one night a friend had told him he was dying, so Zebrino started doing CPR to keep him alive. And eventually he couldn't do it anymore, and his friend passed away right then and there. Now, there were 17. Another boy named Numa was starting to get repulsed with the thought of eating human flesh, and he would waste away, weighing only 55 pounds when he too died. Now, they were at 16, and when the days reached December and the boys were 2 months into the crash, many of the dead were already eaten. They ate every part of the bodies that they could consume, and it was getting to the point where the only bodies that would be left would be Nando's mother and sister. The entire time they had been stuck in the Andes, Nando was said to have hardly given up hope and was all too eager to find a way for him to get back to his father and tell him the devastating news about his sister and his mother. He was determined to live and get the hell out of there. By day 60, Nando figured out that they either needed to leave or else it was only a matter of time before they would perish and waste away. He made the decision that he himself was going to leave for help and was asking some of the boys, like, who's coming with me? Roberto would speak that some of the boys were acting cowardly and they weren't willing to go with Nando, and when Nando asked him to go because he was smart and could help him navigate, Roberto said that he had to go. 3 of the boys would leave together, Nando, Roberto, and a boy named Canis, but they called him Tintin. Carlitos would be the one who figured out that he could make a sleeping bag of sorts with insulation from the plane, as he used a homemade needle, and using some copper wire, he sewed together a makeshift sleeping bag for the last expedition. Before Nando left, he asked Carlitos if he could kiss his rosary and told him that it was important, that if they left and they never made it back, that if they needed to use his mother and sister to stay alive, then to do it. As the 3 boys set off, they each had rations of human flesh that could last them each 3 days, and they carried it in rolled-up socks. They would say the first day they were excited and ready to go, but they quickly realized that climbing the initial 2,000 feet at a 45-degree angle was much harder than they had thought, with the backsliding, and what they thought would take just 1 day took them 3. The boys back at the fuselage said that they could see the tiny dots now in the white snow, but that they could see them. Nando would say that it was not courage that drove the men, but fear of what they were doing. They thought that if they could climb to what they thought was the summit of the mountain, then they would be able to see green valleys in the distance, as they sort of could from very far away when they had explored before. They could also see some spark of light very, very far that let the boys know their way to civilization, regardless of how far that could be. It was said that when it comes to judging distance on and in mountains, it's extremely hard. Like, you won't think that something will be far, but you're usually very off and really wrong, and that's what happened to the boys. When they reached the top of the 3-day hike to what they thought was the summit, turns out that it was a false summit. And they didn't see valleys or anything green. Instead, they only saw more mountains, more ice, and more snow. I guess because the pilot and co-pilot were mistaken, the boys headed west, thinking that they were much closer to Chile than they were. Had they headed east, they would have hit a hotel within 18 miles of the mountain, which is still very far. But because they went the opposite direction, they would be surrounded still by mountains on all sides. Turns out there was a huge river on the east side that they would have surely died trying to cross to get to the hotel, so it's actually better that they didn't go that way. One thing that ended up being crazy, though, was that as they were climbing and exhausted and freezing after the false summit, Roberto saw in the distance of what he thought was a road. But the boys decided the chances of that being a road was 1 in 1,000, and they needed to keep on the path that they were on. Turns out that it was a road. Not that it would have been a well-traveled road, but still, it was a road indeed. But they couldn't chance it. They were now out of food, and they couldn't turn back, feeling like they would maybe die either way. So, Nando and Roberto decided that if they were going to die anyways, they were going to die trying to live. They told Tintin to head back to the rest of the group and tell them that they were going to continue on. They took Tintin's clothes that he could spare and any rations left, and Nando and Roberto continued on. The pair never built a shelter on their long and death-defying trek. On the documentary, they showed at some point where they would stop on each night, and it would take them a full 10 days before they saw anything of hope. 10 fucking days of walking, climbing, hiking, freezing, and starving in the fucking Andes. Can you imagine? They had experts that climb on that documentary that were saying they always have like an essential set of gear. Things like ropes, anchors, food, water, glasses, or goggles, or whatever. They had this long list of shit. And those men had nothing. They had only the tools that they were able to make and each other, and that was it. Roberto would talk of it raining on them and how they would lose hope at time and they wanted to stop and die. And I believe that it was Roberto telling Nando, but it could have been the other way around, that if they still had breath in their bodies, that they were still alive and needed to continue on. It got to the point where Nando would say that he was just going to keep going until he literally ran out of breath and died. That was his goal, to just go until his breath ran out, with just one foot in front of the other. Even a step into the terrain and elements that they were facing took almost their entire bodies to lift the leg. We're talking about impossible conditions. Finally, the boys would come to a line where the ice had receded, and Roberto said that that line that they came to was between their life and their deaths. They started to see barely the first signs of something besides ice and snow. Remember, when you're up that high, nothing grows up there. So there was no grass, no trees, nothing, until they had trekked through enough where sprinklings of anything were starting to come. Just this tiny patch of green came about, and Roberto said that they felt like they were at a 5-star hotel because they had this tiny patch and a river next to them, so they could eat the grass and drink from the river. He spoke to just how much we feel that we need in our lives, and we really don't need it. I think it speaks to just being thankful for your breath. The tiny bit of grass and some water speaks volumes to what these guys had gone through. Holy shit. As temperatures were slowly rising, the freezing surrounding elements that had kept their human flesh frozen was starting to melt, and the flesh was getting rotten. At one point, Roberto would come down with dysentery, and if he didn't find help soon, he was going to die. Eventually, the boys would see one cow, and they knew that somewhere out there had to be another human. The boys would come up to a river where Roberto basically collapsed after having trekked 40 miles in 10 days over the Andes with next to nothing. And a little further, as Nando was walking, looking at the river that they would have never been able to cross, he sees a man on a horse looking straight at him with shock. The man seemingly could not believe that some guy had just walked out of the Andes. The man eventually left and the boys were stuck there. The next day, they would again see a man on a horse, and they were waving and shouting, but the river was too big and too loud for the man to hear anything. So the smart man had grabbed a rock and tied a piece of paper and a pencil to it, and he threw it to Nando. Nando scribbled furiously on it and threw the rock back to the man, and when the man opened it, the note read, quote, "I come from a plane that fell into the mountains. I'm Uruguayan. I have a friend up there who's injured. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We have to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how. We don't have any food. We are weak. When are you going to come and fetch us, please? We can't even walk. Where are we?" End quote. I want to take a second and just let that sink in. Can you imagine reading that note? We can't even walk. We have no food. We are injured, and there are still 14 injured people. Please help us. And even, where are we? Nando himself had thought that that was the most important line of the note because he said that he had absolutely no idea where they were. When Nando threw the rock back to the man and he read it, he looked at the note and back at Nando a few times, seemingly in disbelief, and then gestured to Nando to wait, and then he threw him some cheese and bread. Remember, this is basically like the first thing besides those teeny tiny chocolates and human flesh that these boys have had to eat in 2 whole months. Can you imagine how good the taste was? Oh my God. The man got on his horse and had to ride a full 10 hours on the horse just to get back to civilization. That's how far up they still were. And that's after having trekked across the mountains for 10 full fucking days. Nuts. The man had brought back with him 5 or 6 military men. When Nando and Roberto would be picked up by the men, they were so happy and thankful to be leaving behind death and now got to embrace their lives in that moment. On December 21st, 1972, there is actual footage of Nando and Roberto with the military men on horseback, and this was 71 days after the crash. Sergio Catalan was also in a picture with the boys. He was the rancher who had found and saved them. Eventually, a reporter would come and talk to them, and he asked how did they survive and what did they eat? And Roberto said they weren't going to talk about that. Back at the fuselage, the boys would hear over the radio that 2 survivors from the plane crash of Flight 571 2 months prior had been found and were alive. All of the rest of the boys left, smiled, and celebrated, and they freaked out when they heard. Helicopters showed up to where Nando and Roberto were and asked Nando to circle where the plane had crashed and where everyone else was. They looked at the circle in amazement and said they will never be able to find it and told Nando he would have to go with them. So they put him in a helicopter, gave him a helmet with a mic, strapped him in, and they took off. All I could think was this poor kid just went through hell for 2 months. That all started with him being in an aircraft over the Andes, and now he has to get back into another aircraft and head into the Andes, and he did it. It's fucking insane how strong-willed this young man was and what he went through and was able to talk about it one day like it was just a part of his life. He said the whole way to the area, the pilots kept asking him if he was sure he knew where it was and maybe he was lost. And he said he had been all over this area and he knew where they were. He said the helicopter started having a hard time and vibrating the windshield and that the engines were using max strength as they crossed the final mountain. And then Nando would shout to the pilot, "There it is." They still couldn't see the plane until they were only 300 feet away. The men were in the picture on the ground with their hands and their fists up in the air cheering, and they were so happy to be getting rescued. When they got down to the ground, Nando said like 3 of the men jumped in and he grabbed them and he held them, and then they had to shut the door and take off. And the pilot asked how many were they able to get, and Nando said 3. By early the next morning, all of the remaining survivors had been rescued. They were all taken to a hospital where Nando's sister, the one that was still alive, screamed and pushed her way through people to get to her brother. As the news was coming out about what they had to do to survive by eating the bodies of the deceased, they were reported as cannibals and savages or whatever. But they weren't, of course. They just did what they had to do to survive. It was neat to see towards the end of the documentary the family that Nando ended up with, and his wife and 2 daughters, and their life seemed so happy. Nando would end up racing cars and enjoying his life as well as the others. They were said to have gotten together each and every year on the anniversary of their date of being rescued. Eventually, it seemed that some of the survivors were able to make it back to the site of the crash, where a memorial was put up for the ones who had died, including Nando's mother and sister, who were still buried there. Nando was able to name one of the highest mountains, and he named it after his father. When they were later asked if they ever felt guilty for being alive, he was immediately like, guilty for what? Like, hell no, they weren't guilty, that they were seemingly so thankful for the gift of life. During one of the times that Nando and Roberto had gone back with their families, maybe this was the only time, or maybe they were able to go more, I'm not really sure, but they were mountain climbing and such, and they saw a dirt road with a man riding a horse. And sure as shit, it was fucking Sergio, the man who had helped save them. Nando said that they ran up to him and tapped him on the shoulder, and they said that they were lost and asked where they needed to go. And when he realized it was them, Sergio started crying. It was now 35 years since he had saved their lives. They had a picture together all that time later. It was awesome. And that, my friends, is the story of the Uruguayan Flight 571 that crashed into the middle of the Andes, and the survival stories of 16 young men. Wow, what an incredible story, right? I'm not kidding. This was one of the most inspiring, incredible, and just shocking stories and documentaries that I have ever seen. I hope that you guys will really go watch it. I just gave you guys basically the shortened version of it and the book, but the details are wonderful, and I have had to leave them out, or this would have been even longer, but I did my best. The will to survive, I think, is so much stronger than any of us might realize, and it was mind-blowing to see what these boys went through and how they lived that long after the crash. Like, how did the boys not fight? How did they all become all right with Nando being the leader? Does it just come down to the fact that nothing else matters in a life or death situation? It made me feel like the tiny and petty shit that we deal with on a daily basis is so stupid, and we should be so thankful just for the water, food, grass, and people in our lives. Nando said it best when he talked about the only thing that mattered to him in life after that, and what he could share with others, was just love, and the love of his family and how important that was. It's what kept him going, wanting to see his father again. Such an amazing journey. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about this story as much as I did, and I hope to see you guys next Monday for our regular episode here on The Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye. Well, that's it for today's Hidden Files. Do you have a story that you want me to cover? Please submit it on the website, TheKillFile.com. And while you're there, take a look at the merch website for some fun true crime merch and to help support the podcast. Have a comment or something to add? Follow us on the Kill File's social media platforms. Please rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to help boost the podcast where others can find us and listen as well. I hope to see you guys next time here on the Kill File, where nothing stays buried forever. Stay safe, you guys. Bye.